Thank you, Kubo Duo and John Osaki, for those two videos. And thank you, Candace and the Dream Committee at UC Davis for entering into our segment. We are about to start our second panel here today at our event, Change is Going to Come. I'd like to invite the panelists to join me now in our main room here. I'll get started with, okay, here we are. Hey, everybody. Welcome to our panel. This panel, everybody, is what we're calling Never Again Again, Memories of Japanese American Redress for Decarceration and Reparations. I'll give a little bit of a background on the panel and then we'll get right into it. So as kind of we saw in these videos from these two different stories about Japanese American history, that following strong anti-immigration sentiment directed at Asian populations in the United States, over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry, about 2/3 who were American citizens by birth, were incarcerated during World War II. This was a massive upheaval that uprooted communities, it forfeited businesses and property, and drastically restructured family life. Before and after incarceration, Japanese Americans employed narratives of American assimilation and loyalty to resist efforts to exclude them from political economic life, framing their experience as a model minority. Decades later, a movement for acknowledgement and gaining redress for those incarcerated was largely championed by children of camp survivors as well as camp survivors themselves. This redress process was in many ways a rejection of the model minority and promoted healing of intergenerational trauma, as well as an explicit goal of preventing similar injustice from occurring again. And as we see today, in the United States, we have aggressively targeted and incarcerated migrant communities. Minority groups continue to face disproportionate rates of violence, arrest, incarceration by law enforcement and the judicial system, particularly Black and Latinx communities. And these inequities have profound and lasting consequences on generations of Americans. So, using lessons from the Japanese American incarceration and the redress movement, our panel today will discuss ways in which Asian Americans today can identify and reject formulations of the model minority and work in solidarity with affected communities towards decarceration and current movements for redress and reparations. And maybe in a more general way too, like how can we come together, regardless of our background, and seek to see justice carried out in our communities, in our country, our society. So I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Our panelists today are community organizers and leaders who have fought to preserve the memory of Japanese American incarceration so that it might not bear out again in U.S. history. Joining us, we have Dr. Satsuki Ina. She is herself a survivor of incarceration and one of the founders of Suru for Solidarity. Janice Yamamoto Luszczak is the current president of the Sacramento chapter of the Japanese American Citizens League. Susan Hayase is a co-founder of San Jose Nikkei Resistors and is a longtime activist and community organizer. She was part of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations, as well as Professor Lisa Ikemoto from UC Davis. Let's go Aggies! Is a professor of bioethics here at UC Davis and public health law. And she was also a lawyer during the Japanese American Redress as well as part of the National Coalition for Redress and Reparations. So I'm so honored to be with you today, speakers. Maybe I could just give everyone just a little second to introduce themselves and we can start talking about some of our questions. I can just popcorn it around. Why don't we, the same order, Dr. Ina, Satsuki, would you like to say hi?
Hello, thank you very much. I really particularly enjoyed the Kubo duo compression of the JA history. That was really wonderful. And I could see that it would be really valuable for high school and even elementary school kids to get that artistic and fun, but also very accurate historical account. So thank you. Honored to be here with the other panelists.
Thank you. And Janice?
Yeah, I'm again very honored and very, like I said before, you know, I'm with some very notable people here. And yeah, I agree with Satsuki's, you know, assessment of what's going on. I really think we do have a role to play in today's activities.
Thank you. And Susan?
Thank you so much. I also am very honored to be here. Thank you for asking me. And I also was very impressed by the video presentations, and the footage of Ronald Reagan really is making my blood boil, so I'm ready to go.
All right, ready to fight here. And Lisa Ikemoto, professor.
Thanks for having us. I want to thank all the organizers too. This is a wonderful event. I really appreciated the preceding programming as well. And as a native Californian, I think I had the same reaction as Susan to seeing Ronald Reagan up there. So I look forward
Good.
to our
primed
conversation.
Ready to go. All right. I think before we get started with some of our questions today, we actually, I think it's a kind of thing that we should talk about as the language used to describe this period and the incarceration itself. Oftentimes we learn about this as the Japanese American internment. However, sometimes that might not be the most specific language or the best language to use. And I think I would like to ask Satsuki if she could maybe give us a little primer on that.
Sure. I think, you know, one of the goals of academics and scholars today and community organizers is to make sure that we are using our narrative and not the narrative that was imposed on us. And although the word internment to capture the experience of the Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II has become a very familiar term and one used very broadly. Many people today are urging that we use a more correct naming of the experience, that these were concentration camps, prison camps, mass incarceration. And to distinguish that from the internment camps, there were Department of Justice, federal internment camps that were governed by the Geneva Convention and was designed to hold enemy aliens during World War II. So there's a really distinct difference between the civilian operated War Relocation Authority camps, the 10 camps, and to not confuse those with the legally, internationally recognized naming of federal internment camps, because the Japanese Americans who are held in the WRA prison camps, many of them were American citizens and not enemy aliens.
Thank you for that, Satsuki. And we'll try our best to use that correct language, as maybe we can all kind of try to use more specific language to really highlight the injustice that was done during this time. So I want to bring our panel to our first question. Our first question is that incarceration or being at camp is a defining moment in the Japanese American experience, and its lived memory has been an important part of Japanese American identity movements and activism, including Manzanar pilgrimages, the Redress Movement we talked about, movements for civil rights today. However, many camp survivors were not very vocal about their experience of the war, and there was varied responses among camp survivors, even about talking about their incarceration. And I know this is such a great panel we have today, though, because I think each of our panelists has a bit of a different experience with that. And I was hoping we could get a little bit, more insight about this dynamic from our panelists, as well as if you could share your own personal experience in the learning of or the remembering of incarceration. Should we, I think you want to just try to popcorn it, or do you want me to pass it around?
Well, I can start off. So when people talk about the role of Sansei and Nisei in the redress movement, I think there's, sometimes it's kind of shorthand, but sometimes it kind of turns into a stereotype. And I think I just want to say that in the decades after camp, that was when the model minority strategy, I call it a strategy because it was a strategy deployed by political leaders to pit Japanese Americans against Black Americans. But during that same time period when that strategy was being deployed, all generations of Japanese Americans were struggling under US racism. And I want to say that the redress movement emerged out of all generations, not just out of one generation. I think that there were something that many people don't know, and the model minority story does not reveal that many Sansei were facing racism and gangs and drugs and suicide. And there were a lot of social problems that Sansei, were supposed to be super achievers, but there were a lot of issues facing Sansei. There also were, part of the model minority says that Japanese culture makes Japanese people take care of their elders, and that it's an innate cultural value, and it is a value. But there were also Issei living in poverty during this time period, without social security, without services, without healthcare. And I remember there is a social worker in Los Angeles who reported that he found Issei living, eating cat food because they were so impoverished. And for Nisei, there was a lot of employment discrimination. And for those making their livings in Japantown, there was a direct threat from redevelopment and urban renewal and destruction of the physical community. And so the redress movement was actually kind of a part of a continuum of a struggle to repair and unite and build the Japanese American community in response to all these aspects of racism. And a lot of them started with Serve the People programs to help Sansei youth deal with racism and to help Issei deal with just feeding themselves. And also, I think that the Rejust movement directly grew out of the movements to defend Japantown. So, yeah, so anyway, that the stereotype about the Sansei saving the Nisei, I think is, you know, it's just a little too thin. And the reality is that all generations were struggling to deal with inequality in this country. And I'll just briefly just say for myself, I was really lucky that my parents talked about camp. And so, and they left this book lying around. It was called Citizen 13660 and by Mina Okubo, and it was like a cartoon book. But I read it over and over again. It was a story of her going to Topaz. And I still remember the moment when it dawned on me what it meant. And I remember I saw red because I remember my parents being treated poorly by other people. And so I finally understood what that all meant. But yeah, so I feel very lucky that my parents did not hide anything from me.
Any of our other panelists want to?
I think that, you know, people often talk about how they didn't know about what happened because their parents were silent. And as a psychologist, I see that as a form of the collective trauma afterwards, since there was no single act, that a crime that they had committed that put them into captivity. There was a fear afterwards that they could be, you know, incarcerated at any moment again, even after they were released. Also, because you know, Japanese values of community and collective perspective, to be cast out, even if you were innocent, but cast out of the community, was really experienced as shame. And the incarceration experience was very humiliating. And so the pain of talking about that or sharing the story was something that many patients or many people said to me that they didn't want to burden their children with that. So it was a continuation of the trauma of the incarceration that there was silence. And then the second part of your question, although I knew about the camps, it wasn't until actually after redress that I realized how much I didn't know. I'd been living in Europe and when the redress bill passed, and so on the way home, we stopped at the Smithsonian Institute where they were doing an exhibit about the Constitution and about the incarceration of the Japanese Americans. And so I had my junior high school son with me, and we walked into that exhibit and turned the corner, and there was this very large photo of men standing inside of a jail. And although it was a little fuzzy, I recognized my father. And I was so stunned because I had no idea where or how or why he was there. So from that point on, I realized how much I didn't know. And it began for me, the need to research and ask questions and organize discussion about what happened during World War II. Go ahead, Lisa.
Yeah, pass it on.
Hey. So I'm Sansei, and actually because of various circumstances, neither of my parents were subject to the mass incarceration. So, you know, tapping into the history that was just sort of shown in the video and in the wonderful by the Kubo duo. On my mother's side, my father was going to be, he was being investigated, right? They were going to send him to Crystal City, one of the DOJ centers. And in order to avoid being, having the family split up, my family left West LA in the middle of the night in a truck. And they moved to Utah, which was not subject to the order, despite the fact that there was an incarceration center there. So my mom spent her life in Salt Lake City until after college. My father's family was sent to Gila River, but my father had gone to visit his grandmother earlier in 1941. So he was in Japan and survived the war there. So he had a horrific experience, I think, and has talked about that, but was not at Gila River with the rest of his family. He was separated. So I learned about it from my grandparents, and they never raised it until I asked them. Once I asked them, they were very forthcoming and able and willing to talk about it. But it was interesting to me. I think part of particularly my grandfather's outlook was that he had moved to the United States initially with his parents. They went back to Japan and then came back because he realized in Japan he was subject to the draft. So he came here, and for him it was, I think he saw the United States as a land of opportunity. He was this very forward-looking person. And I think that kind of, that's a partial explanation, I think, of why he hadn't initiated those conversations himself. And I think the other part of it goes to what other people have said, is that the sense of not just trauma, but precarity, right? That we're living under, right? We're fine as long as we obey the rules that were laid down for us. And so the sort of felt necessity of abiding by certain rules was part of the silence.
My parents were very much like that. You know, I remember when I was in first grade, I think, you know, being a kid in the 60s, right? Even elementary school. My friends and I, we used to talk, you know, what are you? How do you, you know, basically, what do you identify as? And, you know, I had friends, mostly Latinx, and they, you know, they came up with different words for it at that time. There were different words than just Latino or Latinx or Chicana. What would you call yourself? And they got to me and I said, I don't know. I really don't know what I am. And so I went home and my mom was cooking, and I said, Mom, are we Chinese or Japanese? And she gave me something that I was very surprised. She slammed down the pot lid and she started saying, did somebody ask you that at school? I said, what's going on? You know, why do you want to know? He says, and she started cussing, and she said, you're neither, you're an American. And I thought, well, that doesn't answer my question too well. But, and I started backing off because she was very, very angry at my question. And I ended up asking a cousin who thought I was really stupid. But I said, are we Chinese or Japanese? She says, oh, you know, you're Japanese. I said, okay. But my parents lived in a lot of fear, I think. And I think they tried in a lot of different ways to hide what we were. You know, decades after that, I was visiting a friend who was born 3 months after me. We were next door neighbors for most of our lives. I went to visit her, and I was talking with her husband, and he said, were you part of that Japanese camp thing? Was your family there? And I said, yes. And my friend, who I lived next door to for all those years, said, I thought you were Chinese. And so I thought, okay, you know, how did they think that? How did she and her family think that? And you know, as I told some of you guys before, when I was in college, I came home from school and I said very proudly that I had been registering voters. I had done a voter registration drive. And both my parents got incredibly angry. They said, why did you go do that for? Now you have to drop out of school. And they were thinking back, and they said, the FBI is going to start a file on you. And I thought, where did that come from? Because I hadn't taken Asian American studies as of that time, but I knew some of the history, more of the history than they thought I knew. And every time I went home for a break, they kept saying, so you quit school yet? Are you out of school yet? You have to get out of school. And I was very defiant at the time. I think I was about halfway through my college years. And I ended up trying to pay for myself, which was very difficult, but I made it through. Finally, though, they came to realize that I wasn't going to leave school, and they started paying for my books again. But it just showed me how traumatic it was for them. You know, I never saw that kind of outburst from them before for anything any of us kids, you know, in the house had ever seen. And the more I think about it, the more I realize just how incredibly deep their trauma was. My dad's family was at Poston. My mom's family was at Hart Mountain. And just coming back, they had difficulties after the war. Some pretty severe difficulties. My father was kidnapped and beaten by some thugs who didn't like Japanese people. And I think that kind of thing stayed with them for a very long time.
Sure.
And they really couldn't tolerate me asking questions about it.
Thanks for such a diverse range of answers for that. And also just, you know, thank you for also helping us clarify that it's not such a clean line, right? It's not just generational. It's not just class. There's a lot of factors at play here. I want to turn our conversation to the Japanese American redress movement. Many of us are aware that we are one of the few racial minorities to have received some sort of reparations from the federal government. This is a current, this is again in the news. California passed AB 3121, was signed into law just recently, authorizing a task force to develop reparations proposals for the state for Black Americans or Black Californians. And a national proposal, HR 40, has been sponsored since 1989, but has not been yet brought to vote. So I think one common argument that we might hear sometimes against the redress movement and against reparations generally for Black Americans today is that people shouldn't have to pay for the mistakes of the past. This was some of the language that was also used for, you know, against the Japanese American reparations movement. And I wanted to know from your experience, if you could tell us what were some of the good that came out of the redress process in terms of restorative justice, in terms of healing intergenerational trauma, and how would you, from your experiences, counter these types of arguments now?
One of the things that did come out of the Japanese reparations is that people like my parents ended up giving their reparations completely towards the creation of a museum in Los Angeles to tell the story. I remember when they first started donating, when they first started getting the donations, it was just a small little office with a few photographs in it, but it grew to a pretty big museum that's visited quite often right now.
Yeah, my grandparents did the same thing. I think Little Tokyo and, you know, other community centers throughout the United States still exist in large part because people return the money to the community. But I don't think it was just that. I mean, I think that the Rejust movement, the sort of movement itself, and Susan referenced this, right, was a community building effort, right? And it was a consciousness raising effort. When I was growing up in the 1960s, Japanese Americans were never mentioned as part of history, right, in public school education. And that may still be true in parts of the country, but in Davis, where I live, there's a school named after Fred Korematsu. And that would never have happened but for the redress movement, I think. And I think the payment, I mean, the payment seems trivial compared to what people lost. On the other hand, a significant amount of money, and people were able to sort of make good use of it in various ways, both in their own lives and for the community. But it was also, it was a national reckoning. That moment, those few years when those payments were being made, isn't the reckoning, it's the whole process itself. And I think that's important. That's important. And that's what sort of unites sort of that particular law and that particular redress effort with the reparations movements that are happening now.
My mother, when she received her check, I said, I'm going to come down from Sacramento I want to see the money. And so I went to her apartment and I said, okay, where's the check? Because I just didn't trust that it was going to be real. And on her desk was this pile of papers, but on the wall, she had already framed the letter of apology from the president. And it really exhibited for me, because I asked her, what does this mean for you? And she said, she obviously didn't care about the money, but she said that she felt like she finally got her face back. And I think it really illustrated what happened after redress is since redress, the number of books, films, music about the camps has really proliferated. I think it gave the validity of our historical experience and brought out what had been missing in our community was the expression of our own personal narrative about what happened to each of us individually and in our families, and also the blossoming of this creative expression through protest. So I think it's had a huge impact, and really feel like the Japanese Americans are in a really crucial position to support reparations for the Black community.
Definitely.
So, the question of why pay for past mistakes, I think that, people are aiming that question at the issue of Black reparations. And they also talked to Japanese Americans about that. They didn't feel like they needed to pay for something that had happened in the past. But of course, what we said and what we say now is that people are commonly called upon to fix problems that happened before they were hired and before they were elected and before they were in residence and also before they were born. And I think it's really important to look at this broadly, because political mistakes compound, they don't disappear if you ignore them. And issues of justice and accountability, it affects more than one group. It affects what's happening now, it affects what's in the future, and it also affects the integrity of our Constitution and our understanding of individual rights. Okay, so slavery and genocide really distorted democracy in this country. I think one of the things we're talking about now is how the Electoral College, is really a distortion of democracy. And it comes out of slavery, the protection of the political power of slave owners. And we're still living in a system that's distorted by slavery. And actually the scapegoating of Japanese Americans in 1942 and previous to that, leading up to the incarceration is related to this distortion, because the distortion that had been already established in the United States because of slavery was that some people are more equal than others, and some people's individual rights matter and other people's don't. And so Japanese Americans, the incarceration of Japanese Americans was an example of how an unredressed slavery and all the distortions of democracy that resulted still existed in 1942, right? And it still exists now. And I think there are a lot of examples, that people can think of now that we're facing right now. So I think that's really important. But so, reparations is like a political tool to fight for equality. It's kind of like voting, it's like, it's not a religion or a philosophy, but it's like a tactic. It's like a tool. It's not a guarantee of anything, but it's part of a mechanism that we should use. It's in the First Amendment, and it's something that every American is eligible to use. Everybody is empowered to use that. So I also want to say that, Japanese American redress was significant and meaningful, but it wasn't big enough. It was transformative in many ways, but it wasn't transformative enough for our society or even for Japanese Americans. So I want to say that, as somebody who, embraced the movement just wholeheartedly, I was 23 years old, and it's all I wanted to do. And once I found out about the Redress Movement, we wanted to draw a line in the sand. The former incarcerees that we worked with said, we don't care about ourselves, but we want to make sure that it doesn't happen to anybody else. And that was like this moral obligation that we felt to fight for that. And we wanted to draw that line. We knew it wouldn't be an indelible victory, even if we won it, but we wanted to do that. We wanted to try to do that. And that's why many of us are so angry that it's still considered a viable policy to punish people for who they are rather than what they've done. And I think the Muslim ban is an example of that. And I think targeting immigrants of color, that's an example of how we weren't able to draw that line in the sand. And I think that that is, a tragedy. I mean, I think that while Japanese American redress was transformative, I mean, it meant that from that moment on, American journalists could no longer speculate about whether the incarceration was right or not. They had to say, no, we've actually apologized for it. We've actually said that it's wrong. But that's why I'm saying it was transformative, but wasn't enough. We wanted the redress victory to deeply benefit Japanese Americans, but we also knew it was just a token. Too many Nisei, too many former incarcerees did not live to get the chance to reflect collectively on their experience with the rest of the community. And even now, Sansei, we're aging out. And the question is, will we get a chance to fully reflect on this? And I think that one sign that is a bad sign and that I hope to correct, and I hope to call on the Japanese American community to correct this, is that many histories of Japanese histories of our experience in this country go into depth about the camps, and then there's this big gap, and then it goes, and then in 1988, Reagan signed the bill. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a big chunk that's missing there. And I want to tell you that today is the 40th anniversary of the founding of the National Coalition for Redress Reparations. And that movement was very significant, as I mentioned before, that this was the culmination of a community, all generations coming together to fight back against racism and to fight for equality. So I think that if we can do that, we'll be steps farther along on making our redress victory meaningful.
Wow, thank you so much. I think you're already like way ahead of me. My next question for you, and I wanted to highlight some of the work you are all doing in your organizations. My next question was kind of like what Susan was talking about, like after the attacks on the World Trade Centers, for example, in 2001, Japanese American advocacy groups like the JACL were some of the groups to stand up in support of Muslim Americans facing discrimination and political attacks, citing memory of incarceration as one of the reasons we got to stop history from repeating itself, from happening again. Also, like Susan was mentioning, like organizations today like Zero for Solidarity, that's Satsuki's organization, have drawn these parallels between incarceration of Japanese Americans back then and detention of immigrant families today. So you're kind of already answering this question, but the question, in what ways is the memory of incarceration at work in what you're doing, and in what directions would you like to see it go? Maybe if you want to add anything else onto that, or maybe even highlight some of the policies that you are advocating for as well, or your organizations. Should we do the same order as last time?
Okay, so Pseudo for Solidarity came to be without any intentional plan. It was a group of people like myself who were formerly incarcerated as children, and we were planning a pilgrimage to Crystal City. And we realized that not far from Crystal City, where we had been separated from our fathers, waiting to be deported, is where a current detention facility for immigrant families was in South Texas. And so we couldn't just go there for our pilgrimage. We needed to then go and take our story and use that story as a form of protest for what was happening today. And so that's how Pseudo for Solidarity came to be, led mostly by us elders who were incarcerated as children. And then it really brought together intergenerational support for using direct action protests to influence, hopefully, policy But the other part of our work has been about building solidarity across communities. That part of the oppression has been to fracture our communities of color from each other and feel that we had to compete with one another for whatever there was to compete for. And so our actions focus on working with targeted communities and supporting them, centering their issues and showing up in support of theirs. And we've developed this process called Healing Circles for Change, where in the initial stages of our direct actions, we would show up at a protest, and then after the protest was over, people would go their separate ways back to their communities, the Latinx, the Indigenous people, the African-American folks. And then one of these events in Oklahoma, we ended up staying together. And as we sat together, exhausted from the events and feeling really connected to one another, we began sharing our individual stories across communities and across generations. And it was so powerful, the bond that grew from that, so that when there was another action somewhere else in the US that needed people to support, we knew each other and could call on one another to show up. And our desire to break down those barriers that had been built has been a primary goal, besides the protesting of the immigrant detention facilities and promoting and supporting the Black Lives Movement. So I think it kind of emerged as a grassroots protest. And really what we found too is that in protesting alongside currently targeted communities, there was a very powerful healing for ourselves, finding a voice that we didn't feel like we had the right to protest, to speak up against what was being done again. So yeah, so now we have many people who are very engaged with Sudu and very proud of that process that has emerged. Lisa.
Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot of my work, both my scholarship and my community-based work, is in the reproductive justice area. And so I've been sort of a supporter of and participant with other people trying to gain reparations for people who have been forcibly sterilized. Several states have passed bills providing reparations for primarily women, but not exclusively women, and primarily low-income white and women of color. But we're trying to get something similar passed in California. The last bill that went up was in 2019. It didn't make it out of the Assembly Appropriations Committee, but we're going to keep trying. And part of the reason we do this, and we see this as connected, right, to the larger movements that we've been mentioning, is that it's just part of this sort of now centuries-long pattern in the United States of defining American in racially exclusive ways, and doing so by criminalizing whole communities of color, right? And so, or otherwise imposing, control over those populations. And so forced sterilizations were part and parcel of all the other stuff that we've talked about today.
I forgot who's next. Is it Susan?
Well, in San Jose Nikkei Resistors, we started up, as many people in the Japanese American community did when the information about family separation was coming out. And it was such a terrible, terrible crime against humanity that I think people felt like, let's stand up and do something. And I think that some of the first things that we decided to do was to try to unite and mobilize Japanese Americans in the San Jose area, Santa Clara County area Japanese American community. And one of the first things that we did that was very meaningful to us is that Santa Clara County has one of the strongest sanctuary policies in this country. And it was under attack, and when a San Jose resident, a woman, was murdered by somebody who was undocumented. It was very similar to a case in San Francisco, and it provided an opportunity for people who wanted to accelerate ICE arrests and deportations to attack sanctuary policy. And so that was something that we mobilized people to. And it was also kind of an interesting exercise because I think the denial of individual due process to Japanese Americans by the communities they lived in is very similar to the denial of individual due process to undocumented immigrants. So anyway, that was something that we did. We did a number of other immigration rights projects, including a unity quilt to try to engage different sectors of our community, artists who wanted to support immigrants, and this was a way to engage them. We also are working on HR 40 support. We started thinking about this a couple of years ago, actually, because this was coming up. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote a really groundbreaking article in The Atlantic. And then in 2019, Democratic primary presidential candidates started endorsing HR 40. And I think in San Jose Nikkei Resistors, we figured, well, pretty soon journalists are going to start approaching Japanese Americans, and if we're unlucky, they're going to pick one who comes up with the model minority answer. So we felt like we had to kind of get a jump on that. And so we wanted to start creating some motion around Japanese Americans supporting HR 40. And we also have an education committee that's also working on anti-Asian backlash against Asian American students in K through 12. We have a defund the police committee where we've been trying to understand the issue as a local issue and trying to figure out how we can be in coalition. There's existing coalitions in a lot of local areas, and so we're getting involved with that. Also, we have been very involved in the election process. I think it was pretty clear to us and to most people that if we want to make any progress on any of these issues, immigration rights, defunding the police, any of these issues, we have to throw Trump out. So we put a lot of effort into get out the vote across the country, and we are so happy that, and I think I speak for everybody here. What a relief, what a relief. And anyway, so yeah, so we're doing a lot of things, and we're trying to figure out how to do it without killing ourselves, because it's kind of a lot of stuff. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Janice, did you want to answer this one as well?
Yeah, JCL has been putting out, it has been a little bit slower to get things from them because they are sheltering in place, and but they have been following up on getting reparations and working on a lot of some of the same things that were mentioned before. They are in support of HR 40. Personally, I think that that's a very important issue to be coming up. And my personal concern is that so many things can still happen again. I mean, they're still on the books. I mean, you can still have people being incarcerated or put into camps, and they are being put into camps, and it's just appalling and terrible. And it's for us to do something about it, because we do have a little bit of cred, or some cred, in terms of our history. And I think it's important for us to really get the word out and to really support the groups that need support.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to just remind everyone at home, if you have some questions for our panelists, throw them in that Q&A chat. We just got a little bit of time left here. I want to ask all our panelists another question. Oh, sorry, and if you're using the chat, if you could put it in the Q&A, that would be helpful for us as well. I got a quick question about solidarity building, particularly a lot of the groups that are hosting this event today, Japanese American, but also a broader AAPI community at UC Davis. And what our question is a bit about the changing demographic of Asian Americans, how we find, what does solidarity look like between Asian Americans and beyond? So I guess wide open answer, but I guess my quick little spiel for this one was like, since the end of immigration restrictions in 1965, we've had a very changing face of Asian America. I think as of 2017, it looks like about 75% of adult Asian Americans are actually first generation. So it's kind of a very different experience than maybe what we're the traditional kind of Japanese American experience. So I guess I wanted to ask maybe your thoughts on what ways does the changing nature of Asian America still operate, or how do we still operate as terms of political solidarity, and what strategies do you see for mobilizing as Asian Americans today to stand in solidarity with other communities such as our Black, Indigenous, and Latinx kind of community partners?
I think it's a great question because in some ways, like my generation as a Sansei, I feel like we're so focused on the Japanese American experience that, stretching that definition, expanding it, enriching it, has really been brought to our attention at this point, where, for example, Black Nikkei young people are saying, we're part of the Japanese American community. We're part of the Asian American community too. And they want to be acknowledged as part of this expanding vision. And I think the younger generation has a much more positive sense about the importance of expanding our vision about our identity. And it is the future for sure.
Yeah, I agree. And I also think that there is an Asian American coalition. And one of the things that San Jose Nikkei Resistors did this last period was participating in a Yes on Prop 16 coalition. And I think that when the chips are down, I mean, one of the best anti-model minority strategy things you could have done in this last election was to vocally and visibly campaign for Prop 16. And also to partner with Asian American communities that are really struggling with generational issues. I really admire, there are very progressive organizations inside the Vietnamese community that are doing very creative things to bridge the generational gap by like having fact checking in English and Vietnamese language. And that's really brilliant. And, so in San Jose, Santa Clara County, we want to partner with Vietnamese Americans, and we've met different organizations partly because they're also being targeted by ICE, and it's very underreported, and we don't want them to stand alone. And but it's also part of this Asian American coalition building. Also, I think that the anti-Asian scapegoating is trying to help people understand that and to figure out how to join together and fight back against that. And one thing that I've been really thinking is that, part of this different immigrant wave of immigration, I think a lot of Asian Americans could really use Asian American studies for the community. There are a lot of people who would never get a chance to take a class on Asian American studies, but then also to learn about the history of the Black liberation movement, and I think that kind of education in the community would really go a long way towards bringing people together and opening people's minds and helping them understand what's going on now.
Thank you. I'm gonna, sorry, we didn't get to two of our panelists on that question, so maybe they can get first dibs on. I do want to get to at least one of our audience questions. We just got a little bit of time here, so it may have to be a little bit quick. But Joyce Nakamura brings up a good point in the chat and in the question and answers. She says that, you know, she doesn't necessarily think it's about the memory of incarceration being as an impetus for fighting for social justice. The legacy of Rejust and Reparations is that racism still exists and they continue, and people still continue to suffer. So she kind of brings this perspective that maybe it's because it's wrong. That's why she's fighting for these movements, not just because her grandparents were in camp. But she asked her specifically, she wants to, maybe we can kind of get a quick answer from our panelists. How can Japanese Americans best express our solidarity with other BIPOC communities is her question. So maybe we can kind of segue out just maybe a last piece of advice from our panelists.
I think it's important for us not to feel like when we go to another community, another organization and say, oh, I want to help, but to actually say, you tell me how I can help, as opposed to me telling them, oh, you should be doing this, you should be doing that, you should be doing that. I've known people that have actually gone into other communities and said that, and they were, you know, shortly after shown out the door. Because, you know, everyone has their own communities and has their own ideas, and it's not for us to go around bossing people and telling them how to do things. Although we do have some ideas that might be good because of our history. But I think basically to do research and follow through in terms of going into someone else's territory.
Any other panelists want a little bit of advice?
No, I think part of it's just about showing up.
Yeah.
You have to sort of put your body on the line. We can't actually physically do that right now. It would be worse for everybody if we did. And there are different ways of showing up, right? Sometimes it's signing a petition. It's whatever your capacity is, right? But you do it with openness, like Janice said, and you do it with humility. And you do it as a sign that you recognize you're part of maybe not just the Japanese American community, if that's how you identify, but that the Japanese American community is part of a broader coalition. That's really important right now.
And I think that building these coalitions across communities is really essential to having any success in making deep change. So really being active in doing outreach, reaching out to different community organizations and joining in shared educational programs. And, you know, I think we just have to be more active about making that happen instead of standing back and waiting to be asked.
One of the things that we did during the Redress Movement was that we sought out many different kinds of organizations and educated them about our issue, but we also invited them to come educate us about their issue. And it was one of our principles of unity that we said that we, in addition to fighting for our own equality, is that we would support other oppressed people in their struggles. And so I think that sharing of information back and forth is really important. You know, that's one of the things I think that we were able to inspire a lot of former incarcerees with. I remember one Nisei man leaned over and whispered to me at one day of remembrance. He was listening to the support statements by other organizations, and he said, you know, Susan, I thought everybody hated us. And I think that, you know, by seeking out and giving this kind of support and solidarity, I think we can strengthen all of our movements.
Well, thank you so much, panelists. That will be our time for today. It was really an honor to talk to you all, everyone. This was Satsuki, Janice, Yamaoka, Luszczak, Susan Hayase, and Lisa Ikemoto. So thank you so much to our panelists. I want to just let everyone know out there at home, you know, thanks for tuning in. We're just about to go into another music set here. I want to remind people that there are our team members are hanging out on the chats here. They got a Discord channel set up. They'll drop the links there if you want to hang out with them there. I'm going to do my, sorry panelists, if you want to leave, you can stay with me too. I appreciate your smiling faces. I'm going to intro this next set. This next set, I am so excited to bring to you today. Oh, thank you. Thank you, panelists.
Greg. Thank you to everybody. Bakahatsu. Thank you. Everyone from Davis.
All right, UC Davis. All right. Okay, so this next set, I'm so excited to bring you. Sorry, we're just a little bit behind, but I'm glad you're all here because this set is going to be awesome. One thing we like to do with this David's Cherry Blossom Festival, like we said before, it started as a taiko festival for a way to share our art with the community. But this is really grown over the years to the point where 2019, the last time we saw you all live, we had 2 music stages outside, we had 1 inside, and this was going on at Sudwick Brewery. I wanted to spend a little moment of our program to say thank you to Sudwick Brewery, who normally they host us when we have the festival live. And even though we weren't able to meet in person this year, they still sold our seasonal beer release, the Hanami Haze, and they raised money actually for Suru for Solidarity with that fundraiser. So thanks, Sudwork. We hope we can party with you again soon, when it's safe to do so. Okay, so this next set, so like I was saying, sorry, we like, since we've grown, we really want to share our stage with artists who are doing radical, cool stuff with their art, who are making powerful statements and putting themselves out there. So we love to be able to share our stage like that. We also want to feature some new upcoming artists all the time. Try to give people, a lot of people got a voice that they want to share, and if they can do that at our festival, that's what it's about. And so this next set we have coming up for you, I think, is a perfect Davis Cherry Blossom Festival set. We have the Hive Mind, this Bay Area trio. They just started kind of releasing music together as a group this year. This stuff it's hot. You're gonna want to hear this. Followed up our friend Iraya. You might know him as Jay Anthony before. He'll be in this set as well as a new artist at the Davis Cherry Blossom Festival stage, Davon. So we got to get to it. I don't want to hold us up anymore. Let's roll our next music set.